Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are continuing our discussion of Basic Income, a radical proposal for a free society and a sane economy by Philippe van Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght. This week we're discussing chapter 8, which is the final full chapter of the book. And the chapter is entitled Viable in the Global Era, Multi-Level Basic Income. So the big question, or one of the big questions that runs through this chapter is, what happens when one country implements basic income and others don't? Because we live in a global economy. So how does that affect things? How does it affect immigration? Can you do it? What if you just implement a basic income? Does everybody move to your country? Do you have to put up, border restrictions, stuff like that? So let's get into the first quote from the book here. So far, we have taken it for granted that the scale at which it makes most sense to introduce basic income is that of a sovereign state. Ever since Joseph Charlier wrote in the mid-19th century, this is the scale spontaneously adopted by most basic income advocates. Indeed, some of the expressions commonly used to refer to basic income, state bonus, national dividend, citizen's wage, and citizen's income, for example, suggest an intrinsic connection with a national community. Moreover, we have so far taken for granted that the economic and political feasibility of basic income can be discussed within a purely domestic framework. But so-called globalization forces us to look at these issues in a different light. One might even fear that it could inflict a fatal blow to both the desirability and feasibility of a basic income so conceived. So my sense is that no, that this isn't necessarily going to cause a problem for basic income, in the sense that we already have money distribution mechanisms in our economies, and they're not, we can have that and it works, to some extent. And it's not breaking the international economy. It's not breaking the global economy. So if you're swapping in a basic income for, expansionary monetary policy or something like that, okay, yeah, now you're doing something that's more efficient. You're getting people money in a more efficient way, but you still have a money distribution mechanism, and you're going to be able to have that to some degree. The fact that you're in a global economy and connected, the money flows are all connected and everything is all connected. That might affect various things that determine the level of basic income that's sustainable for your economy, but it's not going to change the fact that basic income is a better way of getting people money than overly expansionary monetary policy that creates instability in the financial sector. It's going to be a better way of getting people money than handing people jobs as a way of handing them their money, that kind of thing. So my sense is that I'm not too worried about this. This is something that Milton Friedman talked about a little bit, because he was famously a supporter of a negative income tax, but he was also a supporter of open borders and completely free immigration. And someone, after a talk he gave, someone called him on that. He said, how do you reconcile your support of negative income tax, which is like a basic income, with the idea of open immigration? And Milton Friedman basically said, well, you can't. What I really want to do is consolidate the welfare state into the negative income tax, and then that makes it easier to eliminate it altogether. And then we can get to my true dream of open borders and free movement of people and stuff like that. But I think Milton Friedman is wrong. I think you can have open borders and basic income, because you're going to need some money distribution mechanism anyway. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Hi, yeah. So I guess two things. One, the way that you think about funding basic income, it would be a lot easier to do at the level of a country right now, because we don't have an international currency. So, or at least, there are complications if you didn't want to just have one country give it to everyone. If you wanted to do it in some kind of international currency, that would require a whole another infrastructure and set of institutions that would have to work well and all of that. So yeah, I kind of see it more feasible, even if there are a lot of advantages to an international one in terms of like the short term. although it doesn't seem that feasible to convince people politically to want to do a basic income, like if that were not an obstacle, it seems like it could be done quite easily, like quite quickly in a place like the United States with a decent, monetary management and so on. So just kind of disagreeing with the quote there. And then in terms of open borders plus basic income, I think that it would potentially reduce the amount of basic income that you could afford to give people. So that would potentially be a factor.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. Maybe in the short run that would be true, and that's kind of what they're imagining in this chapter. That all of the kind of least productive people who don't want to work are going to go to the country that implements the basic income. I think in the long run, you're going to, the country with the most people is going to be the one that wins. So even if in the short run you're getting, kind of all the worst people from the other countries or the least productive people from the other countries, it might end up going in the other direction in the long run. Even in the short run, I guess if your way of distributing money is really kind of harmful to people and causing a lot of inefficiency, that might be a deterrent to people moving to your country. So the way we get people now being kind of really punishing and inefficient, might be part of what's kind of making people want to immigrate less. Not to mention the fact that we have essentially closed borders and nobody's allowed to come here. And in terms of, there was something else you said. What was the first thing you said?
The third thing was just like the feasibility of implementing it in the short term being easier at a national level because we don't have an international currency and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we could generalize that to say basic income is a lot easier to implement at the level of the institutions that you already have. So you mentioned, to some extent, you can think of some of the United States institutions as like, the central bank is kind of like the central bank of the world, that kind of thing. We live in a global dollar economy, all of that. But yeah, you'd have to, even though the Fed is kind of the international global central bank, they're still, their job is to, kind of serve the American people and sustain, optimal economic conditions for the American people. So they would really have to kind of, if you're the United States government, especially since, basic income is more of a fiscal policy, if you're the United States government, that's a big kind of shift in how you run your policy if you're considering everyone in the world rather than Americans first. But yeah, I basically agree with what you said. Did you have another comment?
Yeah, just following up on the first point about immigration, it's not just about attracting the people who don't want to work, isn't it also about like just the sheer number of people that you're distributing the basic income to? Wouldn't that also lower the amount, presumably?
Yeah, so if more people come in, you're distributing more money. The way they're thinking about it in the book is that they're thinking about, okay, there's a tax base from which you're collecting the revenue to pay out the basic income. That's not usually how I think about it. But when you're thinking about it like that, if you're bringing in people who are earning a lot of money and, maybe they'll be net contributors to the basic income, but that's not who you'd bring in. You'd bring in the people who would get more benefit from the basic income. And maybe even the people who are contributing the most into the system, might now have an incentive to leave the country to avoid being taxed so heavily, that kind of thing. Again, that's not quite how I think about basic income and not quite how I think about kind of the optimal way of implementing basic income. It's more like it's a more efficient mechanism of distributing money to people compared to our existing mechanisms. Yeah.
But I guess it seems like if you think about it your way, like if you just gave it to United States citizens, they could potentially benefit from production, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. So the dollars you give them, we could take advantage of the fact that other people want dollars in other countries. And like really people could potentially have quite a high basic income if you were to give it to, say, people in other countries, or just more people can come to your country. That would, I think, reduce the amount that you could give per person, at least until there started to be like these massive efficiency gains, I don't know, across the world or something. But yeah, you see what I mean? Like it's
if you look at the whole global economy, and the United States is offering to pay a basic income to everyone in the world, kind of the global per capita share of economic output is a lot lower than kind of what Americans get on a per capita average, or what American like what can be produced for the average person globally is lower than what kind of how we have it set up now in the United States, what we can produce for the people here. Yeah.
Anyway, so it's just kind of, I don't know how important this is,
yeah.
but I guess politically it would be a harder sell to get people to fund it for everyone.
Yeah, I think and I think we'd have to look at how it would affect the level of basic income. Certainly, if you have open borders, if you're already in a situation where you have open borders, it's still true that having a basic income is better than not having a basic income. So maybe it's easier to go in that direction, open the borders, and then later implement the basic income, and everybody's better off. Whereas if you implement the basic income first and have closed borders and then open them up, then you might see a reduction in the basic income and people will be upset or something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Yeah. Well, look, you kind of preempted what I was going to say a little bit, but I'll just recap it anyhow. So you said at the beginning, well, there's already a money distribution system, and that's going to attract people to rich countries anyhow. And it's like, well, if it's a less attractive system, if not just the total volume of money, but how easily you're going to be able to access it is different. That's going to affect the incentives. And I feel like we sort of discuss it from the pull side of it, but really, the other way to look at it is the push side. And it's like, well, we're already in a problem. It's a problem that there's a limited number of opportunities for people to make an income in all of these other countries in the world that aren't Australia, United States, Europe, right? And while in the sense that we're sort of talking about it from the pull factors, it's like it's a problem that people are sort of compelled to migrate anyhow. We should be trying to address that with the world basic income. Like the migration is a symptom of a problem of poverty. It's sort of which we should be wanting to address regardless, which is why I always sort of feel like, we want to put a world basic income in place before we open borders internationally, because compelled migration is a bad thing, a problem that we want to solve anyhow. People talk about freedom of movement. It's not really free movement. If you're like a Haitian who is like starving and has to go to Brazil to look for a job, and then you can't find one there, so you have to go to Mexico and blah blah blah, right? Like anyhow. But the institution, the method of distribution of the money does make it more or less attractive and would increase the pull factors as well.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And the other thing, sorry, I wanted to say is, Bethany raised the idea of global institutions and whether we would have to create global institutions and a global currency. And I think we have to do those things anyway for other reasons, right? Like, it's bad that the Fed has this split loyalty, so to speak, having to manage the world economy and the biggest national economy in that world. And those two things pulling in different directions is destabilizing, right? Potentially. But we also, if we had good global institutions, maybe there wouldn't have been a 20-year war in Afghanistan, and a whole bunch of other things would be better anyhow. So, there are other reasons to build those global institutions and reduce the US role as hegemon regardless. So I think that tilts this balance in favor of, not having the US pay it.
Yeah. So in regard to what you said at the beginning, I think it's true that if you make your country suck, nobody's going to want to move there. Basic income, by kind of solving this problem, makes your country suck less. And I don't think that's ever going to be a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea to break things as an incentive to keep people out of your country. It's like, I'm going to destroy my house so that nobody wants to move into it or something like that. It just doesn't make any sense. You want a functioning economy. You want a functioning money distribution system.
Yeah, but the difference is as well whether we think about it from a national or a global policy perspective, right? Like, so you're still discussing, essentially thinking about it from a national policy perspective, whereas I'm trying to think of it, well, what if all the countries in the world opened up their borders and we as a globe paid a global basic income? Just in those two, which would you do first, right? And I would say pay a global basic income. If you were going to do those two things, every border in the world is opened and everybody gets basic income, I would do basic income first, then open the borders, rather than the other way around. I mean, and the less time between the two, the less it matters.
Yeah, in terms of, when I think about basic income, I'll take it when I can get it. So if it happens before the open borders, that's fine. A question we could ask is, Is it feasible to do after we've opened borders or before we've opened borders? And I think there's, a debate you could have there. I generally support open borders as well. So I think you could you could probably do it in any order and it would be okay. I don't know which order is better. You talked about the Fed kind of falling into this role of a global institution, but it's their job kind of to act in the interest of American people, and that creates this tension, that creates a conflict. It reminds me of kind of the conflict involved in the evolution of the Bank of England, right? They always Bank of England started with a special role. It was created as part of a loan to the English crown and all of that. But it really also was a bank, just a regular bank. It had some special privileges, but it was a regular bank that served regular people. And their goal was to make as much profit as possible. They loaned to the government because they wanted to make money, but not because they're trying to serve the people or serve the economy or something like that. So there was this tension. Is it a private institution, a public institution? Is it some kind of hybrid? And eventually, the Bank of England evolved into being a more, solidly public institution. Are we going to see some kind of evolution like that with the Fed or even with the United States government, where the way we get the global institutions is as, kind of an iteration on a national institution that happens to be in this particular role, something like that. So it's an interesting question. How we get there to the global institutions that kind of treat all people equally. But I agree with you that that's definitely where we want to be, and that's going to be optimal for implementing a global basic income and implementing other kind of global economic policy. So Lewis has a question in the chat. Do people want UBI? I think some people do. I think more people want UBI than really understand what UBI is. Like a lot of people think about it as kind of, the more efficient form of safety net or more efficient form of welfare program, or the answer to robots taking over jobs, or even, like the authors of this book, they're thinking about it as like a way to achieve freedom or something like that. I think these are all true. But really more fundamentally, you need an efficient way to get people money in a market economy. And when that's broken, it causes problems in all these other areas. And I don't think people are thinking about it like that. They're not thinking about it as an alternative to, okay, the central bank is currently stimulating the financial sector to create jobs, to push money to people through wages, right? They're not thinking about it that way. They're thinking the economy is doing what it's doing, and then we want to redistribute some money or something like that. So do people want UBI in the way that I'm talking about it? I don't even think they understand it or are thinking about it in the way that I'm talking about it. But there's certainly a lot of political energy around the idea of basic income, even if you're kind of thinking about it in one of these more narrow ways. And then, the second question that Lewis has is, what is stopping implementation? And I think a lot of things. Some of it's political, some of it's intellectual, right? A lot of our economic theory doesn't really integrate well with the idea of basic income because it assumes that people get their money through jobs, and that you're trying to achieve, full employment of all your resources, including labor, and that kind of thing. So basic income, if the normal way that people get their money is outside of the labor market, that doesn't really fit into our economic model. So I think we have a lot of ground to cover intellectually before we get to a point where the experts are saying that basic income is a good idea. And there's a limit to how far the political movement and the activists can get without kind of experts to turn to. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
I just wanted to, bring up the fact that there are, of course, because you talked about the Fed sort of sliding back into the role of this role of global banker, right? It's like, well, we did set up, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to play this kind of role, right? And yeah, but we didn't. America was calling the shots, and America kind of sort of wants to have it both ways, where there are global institutions, but America's still in charge, right? And this is where I feel like you can't just cut off especially when we're talking about a global basic income, you can't cut off the conversation from the rest of politics very easily in terms of what's stopping it. It's like, well, all of these institutions, ultimately the lead voice is the American government, really. And these are more like, especially the financial institutions, America has a veto at the World Bank. America has a veto at the IMF, right? Which it gets through funding, right? By funding a certain amount of the IMF and the World Bank, it gets a veto power. So in terms of like, first of all, we're living in a kind of a weird hypocritical situation and that's mirrored by the United Nations, which is, essentially powerless without the US. It's there for the US to use to legitimate its actions when it wants to, sort of, right? And we're in this halfway spot. And this is, when we come to discussing a world basic income, it's got to be put in that context of what's America's role in the world going to be? You're going to be, going around the world starting 20-year wars whenever you feel like it without the UN's, with or without the UN's approval. What's the UN's role going to be? And then you figure out who's going to pay it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Does America want to be in this role? And I think in some ways, yes, but also in some ways, no. They don't want to be responsible for all this stuff. And the Fed doesn't want to be responsible necessarily for the global economy, but they don't really have a choice. So regardless of whether they want to or not, they're kind of in this position where they have to do this thing. And if they're failing to manage the global economy properly, then there's no one else who can kind of step up. Now, you're bringing up the IMF and stuff. This is it was an organization that was created through politics, and they were trying to, manage. When the IMF was first created, they were trying to manage the world's gold reserves and ease some of that stuff. The IMF is very limited in what they can do. Maybe there's a path.
That's what I'm saying, right? Like that's the problem, right? That should be the way forward, is developing these global institutions if you wanted to implement a global basic income. Those two things would have to be done in parallel.
Yeah. So the idea is that maybe there is a path. You could have the IMF and the World Bank, maybe the Bank for International Settlements, kind of evolve in this direction. None of them are fiscal authorities, so that might present a challenge as well. They're really focusing on kind of the international banking and.
You see, so that's why you need a stronger UN. The stronger UN would be the equivalent of have something like the equivalent of the US Treasury, which it doesn't even really have. They have interns at the UN doing a whole bunch of important stuff.
So I think everything you're saying is valid. The question is it how easy is it to do that? Right. So on the one hand, you have a situation where it's automatic. The structure of the global economy kind of settled out in a way where the United States institutions are at the top. And on the other hand, you're trying to create this artificial thing, but you actually have to have the political will for that. Whereas the United States being where they are kind of just, it's automatic, right? So it's just kind of this natural force, this natural hierarchy that emerges. Like it didn't have to be the United States, but it had to be someone who kind of emerged on top. The question is, can you really compete with that? Is it easier to kind of evolve or iterate on the IMF to get where we need to be, or do we really take the institutions that are already in that position and just show them what their responsibility?
If you can get sane leadership into the positions to run the US government, then you can change the global system, because the US government is the leader, is the most powerful actor in terms of, if there was reforms going to come from anywhere, the best possible place for it to be would be from the leader of the US government to set, Biden's moving in this direction. And I guess the big thing is, like, you got to think in terms of multiple timeframes. So what do we want immediately? Then what do we want in 20 years? What do we want in 50 years time? Right? Like because your actions now have got to be on a path to in a long term, in another 50 years, in another 100 years, if America's still, the Rome of the 21st century, you're going to have all of those same dysfunctions. And so are we, the people, your victims, as it were, the rest of the world, right? Like,
yeah. And I think you're right that whatever path we take, there's going to have to be some kind of political action on the part of the United States. I'm not convinced that the easiest path is to work through international institutions like the IMF. My intuition is that it's easier to take the institution or the institutions that are already in position to do the stuff and adjust what their responsibilities are.
Look, I think one last thing I'll say, because I haven't mentioned SDRs, the special drawing rights, which are the kind of proto-currency or like a reserve that the IMF issues, right?
Yeah.
Or is it the World Bank? No, I think it's the IMF that issues.
The IMF, yeah.
Yeah, and they're exchangeable for money in that you can repay IMF debt with them. And so like the US Treasury could say, well, we're going to expand that exchangeability and we're going to accept SDRs as, you know, bank reserves as well. And sort of that could support you know, the expansion of SDRs as some kind of global currency, which could be, you know, or the basis of one. And I think there's stuff there to work with, and it shouldn't be left out of the conversation. What exists at the global level now?
That's fine, and I think all of this stuff is really complicated. You can imagine kind of a lot of different paths to get there. You know, maybe it's the SDR that evolves into an international currency. I'm skeptical of that, but I think maybe that's a separate conversation from the one we're having now. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, on that note, I won't belabor the point too long, but just wanted to say, you know, I guess I have a different perspective on it. Like, I think there's an important difference between, you know, what we might call an international currency or an international financial system, and then what actually is an international currency, international financial system. Like Alex pointed out before, you know, the US dollar is a global currency. We might not like that. We might want it to be like, to issue a new currency that says this is specifically a purpose-made international currency for everyone to use. But if one of them is already there and is doing that, someone is making those policy decisions, right? Someone is in a position of, I guess what I'm trying to say is at any point in history, some other government's currency was serving the role that the US currency is serving now. And at that point, and at this point in history where it happens to be the US, I think the conversation institution, you know, if that institution is not doing a good job, we can totally create a new one to take its place and do something different. But even then, you know, it's not about like, we want, you know, the UN, the organization we call the UN, to be doing it. What we want is an organization to make the right policy choices that are best for the management of a global currency. So I just sort of start by observing that we do live in a global economy. We do live in an interconnected monetary network that is hierarchical and does have a kind of single currency that's the you know, the base currency for everybody else. So, you know, then we can just focus on what matters, which is, okay, how is that currency distributed to people? And then how is the global financial system regulated in response to that? So, and from that point, those are sort of the two important things on the global sector. And then, you know, every nation is going to end up having its own fiscal policy decisions regardless, right? So, you know, I'm perfectly happy if the US could be the one to decide to pay out a global basic income, or it could be some weird upstart, you know, company or something. But as long as someone's making those policy decisions, I think that's kind of what's important, rather than, you know, which country's doing it or which organization representing every country is doing it, right? What matters is the policy act.
Yeah, and Lewis has some important points in the chat. He says the IMF, World Bank, and all these bodies are unelected tentacles of the UN and will not act in the best interest of the individual. I certainly agree that they are unelected tentacles. Whether they'll act in the best interest of the individual, I think is up for debate. I think they're trying, and I think there's a lot of experts there that are trying to do the best they can. But the second part of your point, to adopt UBI means starting at the smallest sovereign state level. Progress, the usual limits don't apply. This must be the policy to adopt UBI for all. You will never get it in a larger group. So I think there's a strong case to be made that you have to start UBI at a smaller, more domestic, more local level. And, you know, one country implements it. You know, I think the authors of this book are skeptical. They think that the global economy is going to interfere with that. Maybe, as people were pointing out, it would result in the basic income being lower, the fact that you're in a global context. But it's still worth it to fix something that's broken, to fix your money distribution system and have it working properly, have it functioning. And I think if one country does it, and everybody else sees the success of that country, they're like, oh wait, maybe we should do this too for our people. And then you can go from there, from, like once most of the countries of the world have implemented their domestic basic incomes, then maybe you can start to think about combining them and having it managed by an international institution or something like that. But I think that's an organic way that it can progress. I don't think the global nature of the economy is going to interfere with that. I don't think there's this race to the bottom problem that they're talking about in this chapter. I think it's the opposite, that the country that implements basic income is going to be at an advantage compared to other countries. My intuition is that's probably going to be the way it goes. Ultimately, we want to get to a global basic income. The question is, how do we get there? What are the stepping stones? Go ahead, Austin.
So look, I mean, I don't want to go too far down this because I'm going to general world federalist territory now, right? But when someone brought up that the UN is unelected, and it's like, yeah, well, the solution that I and a bunch of other people actually advocate for is the creation of a world parliament, which then leads the reform of the UN, the IMF, whatever global institutions you have. There should be a democratic body that is ultimately responsible for, that's directly elected by the population of the world, that is actually who these global institutions are accountable to, right? So that's actually the long-term goal in my mind, and the world basic income goes with that. So you have a world parliament, world basic income, right? And that sort of solves the unelected problem. And, like what Derek was saying before, it doesn't matter who makes these decisions. It's like America is founded on the basis that it does matter who's making these decisions and who has a say in choosing those people, right? That it's not, that the British Parliament just delivering better outcomes wouldn't have been enough, because that probably could, there were probably other ways to do that, right? I think that was right. I don't think the American Revolution was a bad idea personally. And I think that same principle applies now. If you're going to have a global policy, global monetary policy that should be ultimately accountable to a globally representative body, and that's that's where the people in the world federalist movement go with it. They say, well, we already have all these institutions that were set up mostly at the end of the Second World War. They're due for a reform of some kind. So you elect, some people to do it. The next step is like what's called, people suggest, a parliamentary assembly. So you just get parliamentarians from existing nations to get together and like write the rules for the next, to actually set up an assembly, a democratic assembly at the UN. That's one part of it. And like the one person who made this really famous is George Monbiot. And he wrote a book in like 2003 about this. And a year afterwards, I was talking to another author who knew him, right, about global warming. And he's like, we don't have time for any of these big reforms. Global warming's coming. It's going to destroy us all. And we can just get action on this one issue because there's all this agreement. If we can show people that it's the right thing to do, right, global warming, we'll get action. We don't need a global body, right? And it's been 17 years of rising emissions since I had that conversation with that guy, right? And we can't solve these global problems as a bunch of coordinated nation states. It's slightly different because there is more of a race to the bottom with greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Derek's pointing out in the chat, he says he doesn't see the democracy stuff as being particularly relevant because neither UBI nor monetary policy are things that ought to be voted on in his view. And I think I tend to agree with that these are kind of technocratic things that just need to kind of be managed by experts, and they're very simple things. Monetary policy is almost algorithmic, and if we're implementing UBI and trying to get it at the right level for the economy so that the right amount of money is flowing, it's you kind of maybe you decide to have a basic income in the first place, but once you decide kind of what it does and what it's for, it's a very simple thing to manage. It's not necessarily something that has to be democratically controlled or something like that. And Derek says there are certainly arguments to be made in favor of global government for other reasons, and I think that's right as well. I think it makes sense to have representation at various different levels, at the local level, the city level, maybe the state and the country, and then there's different problems need to be solved at different scales. So it makes sense to have levels of government at each and every one, including at the global level. Now, but for basic income, maybe that's not quite as relevant to basic income. So I want to get into the next quote from the article here, from the chapter, excuse me. Whether or not our particular conception of social justice is adopted, should one not instead view mankind as a whole, as the appropriate community among whose members resources need to be distributed fairly? So I think this is the question of whether we should care about people equally, or whether there's some institution that should be responsible for caring about all people equally. Yes, maybe. Probably, but I think the question of who we want to optimize the economy to serve is maybe separate from the question of how to serve those people as efficiently as possible. So basic income is an answer to the second question. If we decide that we want the economy to serve everyone in the world as best as possible, then that would imply that the ideal policy would be a global basic income. Personally, I do want the economy to serve everyone, the global economy to serve everyone, not just citizens of any one particular country. But I think it's useful to separate that desire from the justification of basic income as an efficient money distribution mechanism compared to other mechanisms. And let's go to another one here. The process of globalization is creating such a degree of worldwide interdependence and intercommunication that making the demands of egalitarian justice stop at national borders becomes increasingly arbitrary. Sure, one might even say that national borders themselves are arbitrary, and that they do a lot of arbitrary things. A lot of things stop at national borders, and all of those things are arbitrary. Certainly, globalization makes that more obvious, and national borders kind of stand in the way of globalization. Now, in terms of, I don't think about basic income in terms of justice at all. I don't think of it in terms of freedom, justice, or fairness. I think of it in terms of efficient money distribution, as I kind of keep harping on. But you don't want financial instability. You don't want to force people to be working unnecessary jobs. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I sort of agree that in a certain sense, national borders are arbitrary, but then like a lot of things, where you draw the line itself is arbitrary, having sort of compartmentalized areas of responsibility can be useful when you take a large problem and you break it down into smaller ones. So again, if we're thinking about problem like, okay, we believe that, people should have the democratic ability to vote on laws that affect them, right? It seems that, if you have that one person doing that doesn't make any sense. If you have the entire world doing it, maybe that becomes difficult. So compartmentalizing, we already do this. We have cities, states, towns. So I can see that, that makes sense. It's just that simultaneous to all of that developing, we also have this other thing, this global economy that's evolved around all of those things. So we can kind of put the arbitrary borders wherever we want, and money is going to flow across those borders. Trade is going to flow across those borders. It's sort of do its thing, and it will react to our policies. So yeah, basic income is sort of, it can go in that category of the thing that's about how everything's working. And if you're thinking about a global basic income anyway. So again, it's just one of those things that we can compartmentalize. Like you can make an argument for having the national borders and for all sorts of reasons, but you still want a thriving global economy. Those two things, we don't have to tie them together.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Just because borders are arbitrary doesn't mean they're not useful for some purposes. I think, ideally you wouldn't want to have borders on basic income, and you wouldn't want the borders to prevent people from moving across them, but they might be useful for other purposes. You don't want your police force to be you have certain things that are easier to manage kind of at a local level and divide up. So let's go to the next one here. What we need in order to achieve justice on a global scale is institutions, not discretionary aid. The relevant question, therefore, is not whether any sum transferred domestically might have made a greater contribution to global justice if paid instead to some poor people in poor countries. It is rather whether building the right sort of institutions at the level at which this is now politically feasible in rich and poor countries alike can contribute to the building of a just global institutional order. So replace justice and just with efficiency and efficient. And I'm kind of on board with this, right? Like, the effective altruists talk about, like, where can you send your dollar that it has the most human impact in the world. So, like, instead of giving to a beggar in the street of, Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am right now, I might send that dollar to Africa or something like that and have a bigger impact on more people. But then again, there's also the argument to be made that if everyone in their local, cities and everything were helping the people who needed it, that would be kind of a more robust thing. And then you can kind of globalize that or something like that. So it's not necessarily going to be pointless to implement a domestic basic income in a rich country just because you kind of could have sent those dollars to have more impact somewhere else in the world. Because, like we were saying before, you set up efficient institutions, effective institutions, and then that can be replicated around the world. Ideally, like a poor country isn't going to be able to pay as high of a basic income to its citizens as a rich country, but it's still useful for every country to have kind of the maximum basic income they can sustain if you're keeping it at the national level, and then from there, kind of bumping it up to the international level and providing kind of a more uniform benefit to everyone in the world. Now I do think it's a mistake to frame basic income in terms of justice. But you want the global economy to allocate resources efficiently. It's useful to have efficient domestic institutions along with efficient global institutions. So let's do another one here. Discussing an unconditional basic income in one country may have made plenty of sense at the time of the brief British debate in the 1920s, at the time of the intense North American debate in the late 1960s, and perhaps even at the time of the European debates that started in the 1980s. But how could it possibly make sense in the 21st century, in an era in which information, capital, goods, and people are crossing national borders as they have never done before? In this new context, are the prospects for a national basic income not deeply altered? Indeed, have they not dramatically collapsed? And again, I think, my answer to this question is no, I don't think so. As long as we're in a context where we're choosing among various money distribution mechanisms, basic income will be relevant as a choice. So let's, I'm gonna skip some here. Oh, let's go to this quote from Arthur Pigou. Kind of already talked about a lot of the stuff I want to get into here. This is a good one. So they are quoting economist Arthur Cecil Pigou, who's a famous early 20th century economist. And he says, the establish of an effective minimum standard, if adopted in one country alone, might well lead to a considerable increase in the numbers of population through immigration of relatively inefficient poor persons attracted by the prospect of state aid. It is therefore to the advantage of a state which has established a minimum standard above that enjoyed by its neighbors to forbid the immigration of persons who seem unlikely to attain this minimum without help from the public funds. To this end, idiots, feeble-minded persons, cripples, you can tell this is old, beggars and vagrants, and persons over or under a certain age may be excluded unless they are either accompanied by relatives able to support them or themselves possess adequate income derived from investments. Unfortunately, however, it is exceedingly difficult to devise machinery which shall be effective in excluding all undesirable immigrants without at the same time excluding some that are desirable. I think this last part is an important point, and it kind of reminds me of even domestically, the debate between like what about the undeserving poor versus the deserving poor, that kind of thing. And if there are people you don't want to support for incentive reasons or to maximize the benefit to other people or something like that, then yeah, you kind of want to do this kind of thing. There's this assumption here that some people are your people and some people are not your people, and then the immigrants are not your people, so you want to accept the immigrants that are going to make your people better off and not the ones who aren't. Another way to approach this is just to say that everyone in the world is our people, and we care about everyone, and I think that makes it simpler. The amount of the basic income may be less, but it doesn't make it impossible. And you could also ask the question, is the selective immigration problem going to be more severe with basic income than with other money distribution mechanisms? Maybe. We kind of mentioned this earlier, that maybe if stuff is less broken in your country, then more people are going to move there. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, we did cover this earlier, but I wanted to echo Austin's comments. I agree with them that we already have massive economic migration for jobs. So if there's no jobs in country A, everybody knows that you can get paid better wages in country B. We do see that influx, and in fact, it's the source of many contentious political debates today. So, and ditto with other welfare policies, right? So presumably, if you offer welfare policies, there's an incentive to move. So that's always true, and you're always going to see it be the case that people will, there'll be an incentive to go to some part of the world that's more prosperous than some other part. But overall, we still want to make everywhere more prosperous over time, right? And so, it comes down to, I think people are just making an assumption that handing people money is somehow less desirable or less efficient than than letting people move to get jobs that we create for them, and it just doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and in a sense, since we use economic policy to create jobs, people who come to a country, who immigrate to a country to work, kind of the thinking in this context is that, oh, well, they're contributing something back and they're contributing to the tax base. But if the jobs are also a handout, then they're still potentially taking handouts that could have gone to citizens, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't imagine it that way, but I mean, if what you're saying is correct, then it would be accurate that actually we are already making people move across borders to accept a welfare job, to accept a job that's not really actually helping anybody, but that way we get to feel like they're one of the deserving poor who is willing to work for their money. So once you sort of notice that likely seems to be occurring, then that changes your whole perspective on the issue.
Yep. So here's the next one. Regrettably, no doubt, if generous national or more generally sub-global basic incomes are to be made sustainable in the era of globalization, it will therefore not be possible to dispense with some version of the exclusionary strategy. So I suppose it depends on how we define generous. Throughout this book, they have tried to say, not pin a specific number on the basic income, like we want it the best possible. But then they talk about things like generous, or like, is there a basic income that's, sufficient for, providing people enough security to participate in the economy, that kind of thing. So they're kind of back and forth on this a little bit. I don't, if regardless of the level of basic income, you can sustain. You will be able to set the basic income that allows you to tighten monetary policy and eliminate unnecessary jobs in your economy. This is without any other changes to taxes, without having to worry about, who's a net contributor, net recipient, that kind of thing. So it's still a useful thing to do, even if it doesn't necessarily meet their standards for something that's generous. Go ahead, Austin.
Well, I just wanted to say that this is, what's great about your approach of, starting with the term calibration, calibrated basic income, and expressing how to think about that is that, well, you don't name a number either, but you have a way of figuring out how to think about it. And so it's possible, whatever settings you want to have regarding immigration, whatever settings you want to have regarding other policy areas, there is a calibrated basic income that fits with those other policy settings pretty much, right? And that's why, rather than sort of saying, well, we have to have a carbon tax, or we have to have a whatever the way of funding it is, and people try and sort of cleverly square the circle and solve the problem in advance without knowing what the shape of that problem is going to be, right? So with this, you can determine your immigration policy based on other factors, and then come up with a basic income that fits.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Depending on what else you do with your fiscal policy, that's going to imply a certain level of basic income. If the government decides to allocate all the resources of the economy directly, then there's no resources left for the market to allocate, and there's no possibility of basic income. And this relates to Lewis's question in the chat, which is, where will the money come from to support UBI? And the answer most generally is that it comes from the government. So when the government spends money into the economy, they're adding new money to a part of the economy that didn't have it before. A lot of people imagine that this has to match up with taxes. Taxes remove money from a part of the economy that's not necessarily the same part of the economy that you're adding money to. If you're spending and taxing the exact same amounts in the exact same places, then they're going to cancel each other out. But there's no reason why the amounts have to match up if they're going to be in different places. What you need is money to be flowing through the economy. You need consumers to have a source of money, whether that source of money is kind of pre-existing money that's already in the economy, or money that's just being spent into the economy, new money that's being spent into the economy by the government. What matters is that the flow and pattern of consumer spending is compatible with the flow of economic output. And you need to keep these things balanced with each other. Otherwise, you'll have inflation or deflation. So you can think of almost, I like to call it the consumer slice of the economy, the part where consumers are spending money and money is flowing from consumers to producers, and goods and services are flowing from producers to consumers. And that's the part that matters for price stability. And that's also the part you want to kind of maximize consumer benefit in. But then there's a lot of other things that are happening in the economy. Rich people might be accumulating money, but they're accumulating it in the form of other financial assets or something like that. And the Federal Reserve or the central bank is swapping, money, government issued money, for other forms of government issued debt, like treasury bills and that kind of thing. So there's lots of interesting stuff that's going on. I think in the long run, you don't want rich people to be accumulating too much money forever. So if you want to achieve a long run equilibrium, then you have to have some kind of sink, some place for that money to go. That's not just into the pockets of rich people forever. If you have someone with $50 quintillion and the next, nobody else has nearly that much money, then that person could do the equivalent of, for them dropping a quarter on a sidewalk and disrupt the global economy or something like that. You don't want that to happen. So what's the sink going to be? A lot of people say taxes. Maybe there are goods and services that need to be sold directly by the government. Maybe that's an efficient way to do it. Give the rich people something they want to buy. Make them want to spend their money and give it back to the government in exchange for something. That could be a great way to avoid tax evasion and that kind of thing, because they want to spend their money to buy this whatever the government's offering. That's kind of how I imagine it. But that's a problem that needs to be solved in kind of the short and medium run equilibrium. Rich people can accumulate money forever, and there's no there's no problem in the economy, because what matters is the flow of money going through the kind of consumer slice, the productive part of the economy. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
I just wanted to quickly rephrase in a different way what Alex just said, which is I think the answer to where the money for UBI comes from is the exact same answer for where our money comes from today for things that aren't a basic income, which is that it comes from currency issuing institutions. And the way we currently have our system set up, it suggests that a government would be the most likely place for a basic income specifically to get paid out. That's not where the majority of our money comes from today. The majority of our money comes from banks. But a lot of people are really worried about sort of like where the money comes from. But from a macroeconomic perspective, that's actually not the thing to worry about. We know where the money comes from. It comes from currency issuers. The important question is, where are the goods going to come from for the money to buy? Does the economy have productive capacity for money to be spent into, for goods to claim? Because, you know, if you're assuming that the basic income is paid for by taxes, then, okay, well, what if we raise taxes on everybody to pay for it, but in the process we ruin the economy's production and now we cause inflation? Is that basic income funded? Well, no, it's not. So we would emphasize where the money is going rather than where the money is coming from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people imagine basic income as a redistribution system. So you're looking at the economy and asking this question, well, where in the economy is the money going to come from? What are we redistributing here? Whereas I would say that basic income is more of an answer to where does the economy get its money from in the first place? Right. So it's not competing against other redistribution schemes. It's competing against, monetary policy that is ensuring that there's enough flow of money going into the economy, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Oh, I think I just left my hand up. I agree with your whole perspective. And I just wrote that blog about it, showing how everyone always is in deficit all the time anyhow. And the taxes, the deficit spending is the norm. And that is where I would look, government deficit spending to support a basic income.
Sure. Okay. So let's go to one final quote here. This is a long one. The best way of realizing worldwide climate justice, so conceived, consists of 3 steps. First, determine, albeit approximately, the threshold which global carbon emissions cannot exceed without creating serious damage. Second, sell to the highest bidders the emission rights that match this threshold for a given period. The uniform equilibrium price that is determined through an auction of this type will percolate into the prices of all goods worldwide in proportion to their direct and indirect carbon content, and accordingly affect consumption and production patterns, including traveling and housing habits. Third, distribute the huge revenues from such an auction equally to all those with an equal right to make use of the digestion power of the atmosphere, that is, all human beings. As pointed out in chapter 6, this would amount to something closely analogous on a global scale to the funding of a basic income by a tax on land. So I think certainly this is a cool way to ration carbon emissions. You're setting the amount of carbon you want and then auctioning it off. Instead of the price determining the quantity determines the price. So a lot of times people are like, oh, we want to set, carbon tax at a certain percentage or something like that. I think the auction is a more efficient way to do this because you're actually basing it on, okay, how much carbon emissions can we sustain? Of course, it presumes that we can restrict carbon emissions to the desired amount, but it's also true that there's no reason why the optimal amount of basic income should be equal to the amount of tax revenue that you collect through this scheme. So I think it makes sense for these to be separate policies. You're solving 2 different problems. You're solving carbon emissions with the carbon auction, and then you're solving efficient money distribution with the basic income. So I don't like the idea of linking these 2 things up. So we are getting to the end here. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, you see, you need a basic income policy for income support and to get consumers their money, and you need a carbon policy to solve carbon, and you need a world parliament to run, the coordination of these policies and make sure they're not in conflict with each other, and make and balance it out so that one hand knows what the other is doing. Though you do, like, if you're going to have a price on carbon, then that's going to be that may slow your economy, and that may limit the amount of money you can pay to consumers as a basic income. And so you need a government that's thinking about all of these things, and that government should be come out of a world parliament and a global democratic system. That's the only way you could fairly manage these competing policy needs and decide what's more important, the environment or poverty reduction, right? Like, how do we balance these two priorities? And democracy is how you do that.
Sure. I think that, in terms of like the amount of the basic income and the amount of money that we're charging on the carbon, or the amount of carbon that we're allowing into the atmosphere, it's certainly true that these two things affect each other. So depending on what your carbon pricing is doing, that's going to affect the level of basic income we can sustain. And it's not necessarily going to be a one-to-one dollar for dollar relationship. I think a lot of people imagine that the amount of money that's collected through the carbon pricing can be equal to the amount of money that's paid out through the basic income. And it's not even clear to me that these two things are going to be positively correlated. As Austin was pointing out, the higher carbon pricing, or the limited carbon rationing, that might reduce the level of basic income you can afford. So you're increasing the amount of money that's being kind of collected, but you're decreasing the amount of money that you can pay out at the same time. So this was great, great discussion. This was the final chapter of the book. Next week, we have a special treat. We have Philippe von Parijs, one of the authors of the book, joining us to discuss. And since he's in Europe and he's on Central European time, we're going to be at an earlier time. We're going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern time next week. I realize this is a conflict for a lot of people who are in the United States and working during that time, but I hope some people can make it, and maybe we'll get more people from Europe. So that should be really exciting next week.